Hi, hello, good evening. Thank you all so much for being here for this very important webinar about uncomfortable conversations. And this will be all about talking to your kids and talking to young people in general about race and about racism. And we're really excited to bring this panel to you as part of our Momentum series. But before I describe what exactly that series is, let me introduce myself for those that don't know me. My name is Tori Pelletier, and I'm the Special Projects Coordinator and Racial Equity Project Manager at GPCOG. And for those who are not familiar with GPCOG, we are the Greater Portland Council of Governments, and we are a regional planning agency that serves over 25 cities and towns. And we have partnered with the Portland Regional Chamber, Portland Public Library, Maine Historical Society, and United Way to present to you this Momentum series. So what this series is, to kind of set the scene, is to really continue the conversation around racial and social equity and intentional anti-racism practices. So each month we've been sharing a batch of resources, and we're pairing it with a panel discussion in order to continue to engage with our community around inclusivity and allyship. In order to not reinvent the wheel, we're also hoping to provide a main angle to all of our resources and release them out to you at the beginning of each month. So if you are new to this series, we'll make sure that we drop a link in the chat so that you can register. And our next batch of resources will be about Asian American discrimination, and we'll be providing these resources to you at the beginning of April. So we really encourage everybody that's not registered yet to make sure that you get registered so that you can get that April batch, which again should be released right around the 5th. So as I stated, tonight is going to be all about discussing race and racism with your kids and with the young people in your life. So I'm thrilled to be joined by 3 parenting experts who will provide their knowledge and expertise. And I want to extend a huge thank you to each of the panelists for being here and for spending some time with us, and especially because we're all in different time zones, I think, and so it was not the easiest not the easiest thing to plan. So thank you again for taking some time and spending your afternoon/evening with us. And before we really get into it, I just want to go over a couple of highlights before we start. So the first is that this meeting is being recorded, and it will be available on the Chamber's website along with the GPCOG website after this concludes. And also the chat is open, so I really encourage you to introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, ask questions, leave comments, and engage with the panelists as much as you like while they're chatting. I think that this can be some tough, awkward, uncomfortable subject matter for some, but I really look forward to candidly talking with our panelists and having an informal conversation with them and prompting them with questions. And I also know there will be a ton of questions from all of you, so feel free to utilize the chat as much as you like. We have a 7:30 cutoff, so around 7 or 7:15, I'll try and take some audience questions as best as I can. But with that being said, I definitely will not get to everyone. So if you have a question that did not get answered, please feel free to send me an email. We'll make sure that we put that in the chat as well. And that way I can get your question to the panelist and make sure that it gets answered for you. And really, if you have any comments in general or any suggestions for the series, just feel free to send me over an email. And I want to go to introductions. And I kind of had a list of questions in order that I wanted to ask, but then of course, last week happened with the murder of 8 people in Atlanta, 6 of whom were Asian women. And we also had a racially motivated hate crime against an Asian American woman here in Portland recently as well. So I think as I turn it to each of the panelists, I'd like for you each to introduce yourself, tell us about you, and tell us about what you do. But I also would love if you would add and talk briefly about why this conversation is still very important for us to have, because I think we get into a narrative where people may be a little bit tired about talking about race and why does everything have to be race related. And so if anything, it also might make people a little bit hesitant to talk to their children as well. So as you introduce yourself, if you could just kind of give me a couple brief reasons as to why this conversation needs to continue to happen, I think that would be helpful. And then after that, we can kind of jump right into the questions that I have for you. So Mercedes, why don't we start with you, and then we will just go right down the line.
Awesome. So, hi, everyone. I am so grateful to be here, and thank you to all those involved at getting this all coordinated and scheduled. I'm Mercedes Cemudio, licensed clinical social worker, parent coach, and a lot of other things as well. But mostly that is what I focus on. I focus primarily on working with parents and supporting them on feeling more confident in their role as parents and really trying to establish who they are as a parent. Many parents come in asking me, should I be this way or that way? And we talk a lot about how to just be you and show up as authentically as you can. In relation to the opening question, I mean, my goodness, my heart goes out to everyone who was involved, as well as the Asian American and Pacific Islander community who has to deal with this. My answer to this question is actually an anecdote. Last week, when this happened, I was still seeing clients, and one of my clients identifies as Asian American. And when she came on, we kind of started off with, her treatment plan and things that we were working on. And then she just said, Mercedes, is it okay if we talk about the recent attacks? And I said, of course. And before she could even talk, she began to cry. And as we talked about this whole issue, not just of the Asian American community and those recent attacks, we began to talk about racism in general. And she made a very poignant comment. And she said, I feel like if it's not one of us, it's another person. And in this community, in our culture, race, any type of oppressive status, any type of minority status makes you a target. And how do we begin to change that? And how do we begin to look at this in a different lens? And so I think, yes, it is tiring to have to keep talking about it, especially within the context that we continue to have to keep talking about it. But I think this is why, so we can begin to help people understand that being a different identity, whether it's your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, and so on and so forth, shouldn't make you a target. And the more we talk about it, the more we understand how to connect, how to be an ally to people who identify in different communities than us, and how to see our differences as a connection piece as opposed to a divisive piece.
Thank you, Mercedes. Tracy J, we can go to you.
Thank you. Hi. So my name is Tracy J, and in business and in life, I am the quiet rebel. That is the way that I show up in the world. It is also the name of the company that I run. The work that I do in the world is incremental and organic shifts to the status quo using conversations as instruments for change. And my primary vehicle for that right now is a project called 100 Voices that invites people into authentic and grace-filled conversations, specifically about race and culture. Wow, so the question about why. Why is this conversation even necessary? Why is it important that we're still talking about it? There's a lot of privilege in that question. Being a person who is brown skinned in America, who is culturalized as Black, I have never had the option of whether or not I have this conversation. It is a way of life for the people in my community, and it is all that I've ever known. And so to pick and choose whether or not we talk about race is a privileged question. And so until all of us recognize the privilege that comes with that question, and until all of us don't have to skirt around the question, and until all of us can just talk about it as it is. My friend earlier today actually described this as sort of being able to meet the elephant in the room. And we hear that metaphor a lot, right? The elephant in the room. And so when there is an elephant in the room, you can either approach it with grace and coax it gently out of the way, or you can let it trample you. And so here we are. We can approach this with grace and ease the elephant out of the room, or we can let this elephant trample us.
Thank you, Tracy J. Go ahead, Sarah.
Metaphor. Hi, everybody. My name's Sarah Mclaughlin. I'm a social worker and a parent educator, and I'm also the author of 2 parenting books. And yeah, I agree with you, Tracy J, that it's a privileged question. And before you even said that, I wanted to say, what do you mean? Why are we still having this conversation? We just started having this conversation, especially as white people. Many people felt an awakening when George Floyd was murdered last summer, and it kind of roused awareness for many people who had not had their eyes opened. So I don't feel like we're still talking about it. I feel like we're just getting going, and we have a long way to go, and many discussions, many tough discussions, many confrontations with the elephant, so to speak, to go. If it took us 400 years to get here, maybe it hopefully won't take us 400 more to get out. But I think we're just getting started. So I'm pleased that we're here to keep the conversation going for some, to start the conversation for others. And yeah, glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all again for being here. I really appreciate it. And I kind of want to jump in with the first question, which is really related to the hate crime that we experienced last week. And I guess I'm curious and I'm hopeful that you can all touch on how you unpack the events of the shooting honestly, especially when talking to kids. And I think especially when talking to kids of color, so that they're not afraid to leave their house. And how can we unpack that conversation and talk about racism in an honest way without scaring children so much with the gravity of what's happening and the gravity of things that have happened in this country? And feel free, again, just so everyone knows that everyone is unmuted, so you can speak as much as you like and just kind of have an open conversation.
So I have a question, and I know it's not fair to answer a question with a question, but my question is, why do we feel like we need to avoid scaring children? The world is scary. And for some children, it is scarier than other children. And so I don't know that it's possible and I'm not a parenting expert, but I do have 3 adult daughters. So
you are a parenting expert.
I
was like, that sounds like you are one.
Oh, I mean, I could be, but I don't know that it's possible to have an honest conversation about the way the world is without the risk of fear. Mm-hmm. It exists.
I agree. I was actually going to start off with that as well. So we are both in that same mindset. What's that saying? Great minds, right? Which is why we're on the panel. But I think one of the things that I've noticed so much in the work that I do with parents around differences, and it happens all the time, whether they're social people or not, parents are really scared to introduce their child to things that they're going to have to deal with. So it could be something like sex, drugs, relationships, love. My child watch porn. My child does this. And I'm not skirting away from the question, but I think it's this idea of how do we create a safe environment for fear, anger, frustration, sadness, and overwhelm. And I think that's something that from my experience, I love to start with my parents first. I like to ask them, how are you feeling? Are you scared? Are you angry? Are you worried? Right? Because if you're feeling that, you're going to have a hard time creating a safe space for your child's fear, your child's worry, your child's overwhelm. You're going to want to shut it down the way society has always told you to shut yours down. And so oftentimes when it comes to this, I like to ask my parents, if you had it your way, how would you like to tell your child about this event? And usually it's full of the honesty of it. And they'll usually say, well, I can't say it that way. And I say, but you just said it in such a caring, compassionate way, right? It was scary to hear it, but you were there. I could tell that you wanted your child to know the facts, but you also wanted them to know that you were there to protect them and support them through it. And I think that's the conversation and perspective that we have to have when we approach these. Our parents have to start with themselves. How do you feel after events like this? What came up for you? Getting with your support team and making sure that you're getting your support, and then going to your kids and saying, so something happened. What do you know about it? What questions do you have? And then creating a really safe space, not just for the events, but to also deal with the in-between events. Unfortunately, we don't have much space for in-between events. You just talked about it, right? Something happened last week. Then we had something in Boulder, Colorado. Then there's something, it's like we don't really have spaces to take a breath in this current era, but I think it's important for us to build both those spaces for those intense conversations, but also to say it's okay if we don't talk about it today. It's okay if today we just kind of enjoy our family. And then maybe tomorrow we'll jump back into this conversation if there's still questions or if there's still space to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. You brought up a couple of really foundational parenting pieces, right, that underpin all of this, which are, emotional intelligence, really emotional literacy. You mentioned a couple of them: pain, grief, sadness, worry, fear. These are all part of the human experience, and we can't protect our children from them. There's no way to get through this life without experiencing, the upside of being an emotional being and the downside of being an emotional being. And we think that we're thinking beings who sometimes have emotions, but really we're emotional beings who sometimes can think. It's the other way around. We're emotional first. But a lot of us weren't raised to have dominion or good relationships with all of our full range of emotions. So many parents are kind of, like you were saying, trying to get with themselves and their emotional steadiness and stability first, so that they can be with their children, because it's not really about taking any of those feelings away or protecting them from the feelings. And it's not really the feelings. The feelings themselves aren't damaging. It really is a feeling of isolation with the feelings, right? So it's being alone with the feelings that's problematic. So if we can get with ourselves and our feelings, and I love you said consult with your support team, but like, even if you don't have a support team, call a friend, call someone just to work through your own anxieties and worries about how this conversation is going to go. If that's about a recent event or just about broaching the topic of racism and inequity or whatever it is, before you go to your child to try to be with them about their feelings, because then you're more prepared to be able to hold space and be with them while they, might be rocked by the information that you have to share with them. It's very likely impossible. And then the other piece that you made me think of with your comments, both of you, is about the self-regulation, right? And that we, young children's brains aren't fully developed. And that's one of the roles of the parent, is really to, if we regulate ourselves first, then we're more likely to be able to teach our children those regulation skills, where if they're having a strong feeling, they're able to get through it and get to the other side.
Do you mind if I piggyback?
Oh, go ahead, Mercedes. I want to add to.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the things that you brought up, Sarah, and I think it's important to pay attention to, is many of us weren't brought up with that emotional intelligence. I know I was not. Mental health wasn't even something we talked about in my family. I didn't even understand it until I took AP psychology in 12th grade. So I'm almost 17 and 18 years old starting to understand this. But the layer to that I can share from being an African-American woman is that there's a reason why. There's this space of tough love and emotional resilience that comes through that I think a lot of families of color have to talk about and have to kind of instill in their children. And I think the discussion when we're talking about building emotional literacy really needs to add in that cultural component, that if you come from a marginalized community, whether that be in your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, your religion, and so on and so forth, you probably have an added layer of discussion that you have to have with your children when you're talking about emotional literacy, emotional regulation. I think about the times where we had to be taught about, even in my youth, I was born in the 80s, but even in my youth, how to deal with police altercations, how to deal with authority altercations, right? That was part of my emotional development, but I didn't know that because no one talked to me about what to do with that frustration. No one talked to me about what to do with the anger that I felt at having to say yes, sir, and yes, ma'am to someone who was wrongly accusing me because they just saw my skin color, right? And so I think when we talk about emotional regulation in this context, we also need to talk about the fact that most people get to do view it on this level, but people who have marginalized identities have 2, 3, 4, depending on their identities, other levels that they've also got to get that emotional regulation from. And it has to be a safe space for them to talk about that racially charged or that identity charged emotional space that comes with having to live in a world that marginalizes you.
Yeah, thank you for that. What I wanted to add is something that is different for children now that wasn't true for me when I grew up, and not even really true for when my daughters grew up, is that they have immediate access to information. So if they are not getting information from us, they are getting it anyway. And so if you're not having conversations in your house, you can best believe that the conversation is being had, whether it's being had with you or it's being had with their favorite auntie or uncle, or it's being had with their friends down the street or their friends from school or their favorite teacher. The conversation is going to happen because the news is there in front of them and we don't get to escape it. It's in every device. We walk around with it in our hands. We get immediate alerts when something happens. And as we've mentioned already, things keep happening. So it's not like you can just like turn a blind eye or close your eyes and pretend it doesn't exist. It exists. So we have to talk about it.
And I want to, I'm hearing what you're all saying in terms of self-regulation and regulating yourself first, and also in terms of emotional intelligence. And I want to move to just talking about the existence of race itself, because I feel like if we're on the way to dismantle racism, I feel like it's difficult to do that if you're not equipped with the tools to actually understand where it came from. So I'm wondering if all of you can speak a little bit to how we live in kind of this racially charged caste system, even though race actually isn't a biological construct. And then how are you explaining that and the impact that race has in this country for all of us? And then tying that into the history of systemic racism when you're talking to a child.
So easy question, yeah.
Right, yeah, totally. I started you off with the easiest question I have. We can answer that in 2 minutes, right? Yeah.
Okay. So first, for the parents in the room, if you have not yet read the book Caste, I highly recommend that book. It will help unpack this idea of race as a caste system in America, and also give some historical context as to how it was formed. We don't have time to go into all of that today in an hour and a half. However, knowing that that is an actual fact and not something that we are creating and not something that people are just trying to convince you of, is a thing that you should know, right? That there's a hierarchy that is bodily based in American culture that started with importing people for labor 400 years ago. And when you hold a community of people enslaved and use their bodies for labor, even when those people have been freed from their physical labor, there's still the mental and emotional strongholds that are attached, and there's still the lens through which you see each other. It is the lens through which white Americans, in large part, have seen Black people as property and as labor and not as equal. And it is the lens, in large part, that Black people have seen white people as somehow superior or as something to aspire towards, or somebody to be better than, rather than as equals. And so that is not an imagined thing. That is a real thing that lives in the bodies of the people in America, and that we carry with us, regardless of how much we like to sing Kumbaya and believe that the world is better.
I think about how race has even shown up in mental health, right? And how race has shown up in the ways in which we understand mental and emotional wellness. And so to piggyback kind of off of what Tracy said, if you think about how Black people were just kind of unceremoniously freed, meaning we were freed, but there was no infrastructure for us to move into healthier spaces, to build wealth, to find our footing, to build our identity. Our identities were built on what white Americans thought of us at the time and continue to be this way. There used to be whole studies that tried to say that Black people did not have any pain or they didn't feel pain. Whole studies where Black people were used as subjects against their will, right? And so there's this historic just discrimination and murder and torture. And I know these are really big words, but it's true, right? And so then they say, well, slavery happened years ago, but I always think about it in terms of trauma. Trauma could happen years ago, but it still reverberates in your body. It still reverberates in your cultural and social consciousness. I have grown up in my life knowing the history of my people in this country, and that's a part of my trauma. That's a part of my understanding. And so when we talk about race, whether it is a biological construct or not, whole groups of people have been categorized, assaulted, ignored, erased because of this racial category. And so I think whether you believe it's a real thing or not, you have to understand that whole groups of people are hurt because someone said your race is different than whatever the dominant race is. And in America, that dominant race is white Americans. And so we are always held to that standard. We're always said, do you look like this? No, then you're less than. Do you act like this? No, then you don't get as much. And I think we have to really understand those socio-cultural, those socio-emotional things to understand why in today's world, Black people and other minorities are still working tirelessly to be seen and heard. The fact that we're still having thirst in different racial identities and gender categories is a testament to just how backwards we've been about difference and people who do not look like the founding fathers who created this country under false pretenses, but under that space. And I think that's something to really pay attention to when we're talking about race.
Absolutely. The word that came to mind when you were both talking, and you used lots of different language, but the one that was reverberating in my mind is like the dehumanization of Black people, and that is really the crux of the issue. And while you're saying whether you believe in race or not, my understanding of the science is that there are no actual genetic racial differences among human beings, and that, but then the kumbaya piece, Tracy J, of saying, oh, well, we're all one race, why can't we all just get along? That doesn't work, because even though race doesn't exist, the narrative of race is very, very strong and very, very deeply entrenched. And racism, which came out of that narrative, is also deeply entrenched, very, very strong. I'm going to forget who's, I think it's Beverly Tatum Daniels, who wrote a book about high schoolers and segregation. Why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? She talks about racism in America as like smog in the air that everybody is breathing, whether you are, white, Black. It doesn't, the dehumanization, the story, the narrative of racism, the deeply entrenched, not to even mention the systemic, cultural built into all of these systems, the military industrial, prison complex, I could go on. That's all so deeply entrenched. And even if you're not cognitively thinking about prejudice or discrimination, all of those biases, all of that narrative, we're breathing it in. We're breathing it in like smog, and it has made us all very sick. And it's a sickness that we need to address and unpack. So those were my thoughts when I heard both of you talking. I don't know if I answered your question though, Tori.
No, I think you did. And I think when I heard kumbaya, like that phrase of we're good, let's just love each other, that actually is helping me and leading me to my next question, which is unpacking the word colorblind, because I feel like Mercedes, I see your reaction to that, because I feel even now that a lot of people think being colorblind is a positive thing. And I always hear like, I don't care if you're Black or green or purple, I love you regardless. And why is the word colorblind problematic? And why is that a word that should not be used when talking to your children or we're talking to young people about race? And what can that word do in terms of harm if we're talking about race and differences and inclusivity and we're using the phrase colorblind?
Do you mind if I jump in? Because I
Please do.
unfortunately have a very recent anecdote of having a chat conversation with a group of people who I'm just getting to know and don't know as much, but assuming that at our level, we're able to discuss this. And one of those people said, well, you know, I've always felt like being colorblind was the right way to understand this. This is an older white gentleman. And I was very appalled at that at first, but other people asked, why do you still feel this way? And he had the same conversation as Tracy J about kumbaya, right? He didn't say kumbaya, but it's this idea of why can't we just get along? I get along with all of my XYZ type friends. And we began to help him understand why saying colorblind does not show how much you understand and see that other people have different experiences than you. And from that anecdote, I began to really think about how many people do believe that being colorblind is just, if I don't see the color, then I won't discriminate. But they don't think about the other half of it. If I don't see your color, I also can't empathize. I can't be an ally. I can't see your unique challenges. I began to think that every race is marginalized the same instead of understanding that each race, while marginalization is the overarching theme, they each have their own marginalizations. They each have their own narratives. I love using that term, Sarah. They each have their own history with dealing with marginalization, discrimination, and dehumanizing. Again, another term that I love that you brought in. And so for me, I think that term colorblind used to be something that people would covet as, see how good of a person I am. See, I don't see your color. But now we're noticing that again, that narrative gets woven into racism. Because I'm so colorblind, I can't see that you are having different experiences than me. I'm aghast at it. I've had to tell people over the past year, telling me that you're shocked is not comforting. Telling me that you can't understand why this is still happening in America is not comforting, but that's what that colorblind narrative allows for us to do. It allows for us to be shocked when we see groups of people being ostracized and hurt. We are, oh my God, the pain of it, because you get the privilege. I think someone said that earlier, both Sarah and Tracy said that earlier, you get the privilege to close your eyes and be blind, not just colorblind, blind in general to what's happening. So when you open your eyes, there's a shock there. And so I think for me, my overarching idea is that colorblind leaves you blind, not just to people's differences, but also to the plight and the hardships that people are dealing with as a result of their racial identity.
That's so good. That is so good.
I just dealt with it. That's why when I say just literally within the last month, it's and we're in 2021. So I had to share that because I'm like, you guys, we can't be like this still.
So I'm trying to teach myself not to say you're right, because who knows if you're right or you're not, but I agree. So that's my term. I agree. And also the thing about being colorblind, or the thing about not noticing difference, is that so often we're taught that different is bad. So when we see that someone is different and that difference is bad, then that can lead then to the dehumanization that Sarah mentioned earlier, right? And it doesn't just happen in the direction of white people to Black people. It happens in the direction of Black people to white people. It happens in the direction of able-bodied people to people who are not able-bodied. It happens in all manner of marginalization, right? That if for some reason we don't recognize that everybody around us is different, right? I grew up in the house with a sister, a mom, and a dad. Each of us is different. We have similar skin tones, we have similar heights, we have similar beliefs, but we are very different people. And every person you meet in life is going to be different from you in some way. And so noticing, recognizing, celebrating the idea that every human person you interact with is going to be different is a much healthier way to approach life than saying, oh, that's different is bad.
Yeah, I agree. What I was thinking of when you were talking about color and blindness is, if I don't see color, and I'm looking at you, at people who are a different color than me, then I don't see you, right? I can't see you, like, at all. I can't see you. And then the other piece I wanted to bring up, I won't know the name of the researchers off the top of my head, but I could dig it up for you if you want to put it in the resources. But there is research that they've done on babies, because now we have all this really cool, these little caps we can put on babies' bald heads, and we can see what's going on in there. And babies notice physical skin tone, other differences from the age of 6 months old. So there isn't, if you are trying to make a child colorblind, you're already having to work hard at it from infancy on. And it's not how we're wired. Like, we're not wired to ignore difference. Maybe we can be, as you're saying, Tracy J, taught to embrace it, right? Like, that's a much healthier approach, is to notice it and embrace it and talk about it, contextualize it. I will second the recommendation for caste. I was going to go find the link and put it in the chat, but we'll make sure we add that to the list if it's not already there. But it's really celebrating differences and pointing them out. Colorblindness is just, it's like ignoring the problem entirely. Like, it doesn't allow for any growth or conversation or movement of this elephant that we want to move.
And I want to piggyback off that too, if you don't mind, Sarah, because that research about children being able to notice differences, they do. Kids notice differences all the time. If you're out with a kid, and again, you say 6 months, but by the time kids start talking, they point, they stare, they say, why does this person look like this? What is that? Why does that person have X on their head or a cast on their arm? Like, they ask questions. And what I notice is parents get scared. They say, what do I say? And I'm like, you tell them the truth, right? This person is different than us. This person has this person lives with that. Kids absorb facts so much better than we give them credit for. We think we have to put all this extra on it, but just saying, this is just like I say to parents, you tell your kid that's an apple, that's a dog, that's a table, and you don't fret about how to tell them about that. What do I tell my kid about dogs? You just say, it's a dog, right? It's the same thing about other things that are really hard. Even about body parts, I'll say, just name their body parts. They don't know the sexual connotation yet until they get to an age where that's appropriate for them, right? But for children of color, they begin to know very quickly that they're different, especially if they're around other kids who look different than them. Other kids will point it out, they might point it out, and they might even ask, Mom, Dad, why do I look different than my friends? Why is my friend another color? As kids begin to learn colors, they say, my friend is brown, my friend is peach, my friend is olive, right? They just start to notice this, and there's nothing about difference there. They're just noticing. And I think kids can give us so much insight into how to just notice, acknowledge, respect, and move on. You don't have to make it a whole lecture about, well, now that you saw that your friend is olive, let's talk about racism. It's like, you don't have to do that. You can just say, yes, your friend is olive color. That's true, right? What else is true about them? They have brown hair. What else is true about them? They love, playing with dinosaurs. All of these things are true about your friend, right? That lays a beautiful foundation to, as they grow and start to notice other differences, you've already laid a really healthy foundation, because you haven't added that fear and that overwhelm to these little bodies who are just trying to navigate their world. And so I love that you brought that up, because oftentimes I think when our kids begin to ask about differences like race or gender or anything else, we freak out, but we can just point it out to them and just tell them exactly what it is, and then build upon that as they grow.
Oh, Mercedes, I want to add to. So what you just brought up about pointing out that what else do you notice? What else do you notice? What else do you notice? Helps with the idea that our skin is not the most important thing about us, right? For people of color, it is the first thing that people notice, right? But it is not the only thing that makes us us, right? And because we are not a monolith, having this particular skin doesn't mean that I'm just like the other person who has this kind of skin that you just met, which is a thing that we constantly have to battle against, because for whatever reason, white people don't see themselves as a monolith, and Jane is different from Kim, is different from Lisa, but Tracy and Mercedes are definitely the same because they look so much alike.
Right, it makes no sense.
Not a lick of sense.
No. So I want to pivot a little bit, because I this question came in a lot, and I think it's in curiosity to age, and what age is the age that we start talking to children about race? Is there a magical age when they turn 5, now we're talking about it? When they turn 10, now we're talking about it. Is there
Way earlier.
I was gonna say way, yeah.
Way earlier.
when they come out, when they're delivered in the emergency room? Okay, so I'm curious on if you can talk a little bit about when is the right time? Do we wait for an incident to happen to bring it up? Do we bring it up as early as possible, when they start school, when they start making friends? So I would love to hear from each of you. And I think that question came in a lot. So I would love to hear from each of you on that.
I'll jump in. Yeah, I'll just jump in because I think it is a question that comes up a lot. I've said it a few times, and I'm sure Sarah's had to deal with this too, which is parents always want to know, when do I introduce a concept to children? And I always ask my parents, interesting enough, when did it get introduced to you and how did you feel when it got introduced? This usually doesn't happen always around race, but it happens around puberty stuff, sexual identity stuff, relationship stuff. And you'd be surprised how old people are when someone first sits them down and says, this is something that's going on in the world. Even for me, I think about how no one sat me down. I got a book thrown at me for puberty and was like, hey, go for it, right? And so what I often tell parents is that every concept you're going to introduce your child to, from the most complex to the most mundane, is going to be built upon, right? And so if you wait until they need all the information right today to make that decision, it's overwhelming. Can you imagine if we had decided today to put this together, what we're doing, how overwhelming that would have been? It wouldn't have been able to do it. But that's what we do to kids when we say, you're 15 now, let me tell you everything about life, but for the last 15 years, you've told me nothing. Or you're 18 now, time to be an adult. And you're like, what does that mean, right? And so I'll go with body stuff. With body stuff, you begin talking to them immediately. As they begin to touch their body and notice their body, tell them. When they touch their feet, you say, that's your foot, that's your toe. When they touch their private part, you tell them what part that is. Whatever they touch or whatever they're curious about, just tell it to them. And I said that in my last answer, and I'll bring it back. Same thing about race, same thing about other identity issues. Kids will notice things and they'll say, what is that? Why is that? How is that? And those are the moments where you start laying foundations, because as they get older, they will ask, why did my Black friend get treated differently than me? And if this is the first time you're going to tell them that Black people are different than you, that's an overwhelming conversation. But if we've already been talking about difference, we've already been out to events where you get to see different, I've already immersed you around people who talk different, have different accents, it doesn't feel jarring to talk about what happens to them. And I think that's the space where we think about age. I always say, as soon as your kids ask, that's the age that they're ready to start paying attention to it.
I would have to agree with that as well. My daughters are in their 20s, as I mentioned. They're 23, 25, and 27 years old. And so my rule of thumb was a couple of things. One, I tried not to censor what they took in. So music, media, television, whatever. But if you can watch it or listen to it, you have to be able to have a conversation about it. So if we're gonna watch it, if you're gonna be singing it in the car, if I ask you a question about what I'm hearing, then if you're not mature enough to have this dialogue with me about it, then you're not mature enough to take that in. The other part of that was like, I know that they're hearing things when they're not with me. And so children come to us with a whole world of information. Some of it's wrong. And we have to be able to fix it for them, right? And that starts when they're really small. And if children ask you a question and you ignore the question, or you tell them, don't worry about it, they're gonna just go find it anyway. They're just gonna go ask somebody else. Like one of the biggest gifts my parents ever gave to me was when I asked them a question, especially a question that they didn't really know the answer to, their response was, go look it up. Go look it up and come back and tell me what you found. Now, back then I had to go look it up in an encyclopedia. I did not have Google, but go look it up. Go find a dictionary, go find an encyclopedia, go find an answer, and then come back and tell me what you found, and then we can talk about it. So.
All right. Well, Tori, you were saying like when they come out right then, and I was nodding, and I sort of in jest, but actually also not, because maybe you're not going to be having conversations with your baby or toddler necessarily, but there is ways that you can bring diversity into your home that starts to lay a foundation for having conversations when they naturally occur, and maybe they'll naturally occur more early if you have toys in your home that represent not just white people. If you have books in your home, there's tons of board books. I'm going to shout out the diversebookfinder.org, which is a wonderful site that was put together by Bates College here in Maine, where you can find all different kinds of books with all different kinds of people. There are even little toddler books you can get that just have different kinds of people in them. And so I would encourage parents of young children to like audit what's in your toy room, what's on your bookshelf, because those kinds of that kind of exposure sends a message, right? And then I think it was you, Mercedes, who was talking about how kids point out differences, or maybe it was you, Tracy J. That, basically if a child is old enough to point out a difference, which is like what, 18 months, 2 years old, babies start to point out differences, then they're old enough to talk about race and about, the foundational pieces about difference. I don't think that it's too early to get the conversation started. And I love what you said, Mercedes, that you don't like flood them with all of the information, but if you're sort of like slowly building on the information, then you start to bring in some of the harder stuff if they don't hear about it, right, or notice it themselves, but then you would at least have a foundation to build on from there.
And I guess too, I'll add to you that I would say too, for my parents, it's really important for you to continue to educate yourself. I think sometimes what I hear in that question of when and how and what is, I don't actually know myself what to say. And so I oftentimes will tell my parents, what do you think about it yourself? Have you explored when your child asks you about someone's difference, what that is for you, right? Because if you don't know, and I love that both Sarah and Tracy said, go find those answers. If you don't know, find the answers for yourself first. If your child asks you about something that you've never thought of or you didn't even notice, you can say, you know what, Mercedes, I don't know, but let's figure that out together. Or if you feel like it is a harder question and you'd like to get some information and get solid on it first, say, you know what, let me talk to you about that this weekend, or let me talk to you about that tomorrow, and then spend some time reading, reaching out to people who do this, and getting the information that's honest and real. Because I think Tracy said it earlier, kids will Google. I have nieces and nephews who are 5 and 6 who can ask Alexa to do anything, right? So they know how to find information. One of my nephews recently, the mom said, you can't have, and he just said, Alexa, can I? And she ordered it, right? So it's like kids know how to do things. And so we have to kind of be at the space where if we don't know, say that. If we need more information, get that information. Don't just feel like because your kid is asking you today, you have to have the answer today. Take the time, if you don't know the answer, to find the right answer for that, to understand what the right information is. So that way you're also giving them proper information. So when they go out, they have that information as well.
I just want to add also another resource. Sarah brought up books and toys. So something I learned on TikTok. I'm not proud of that. I'm not proud that I'm on TikTok because I was trying to avoid it. But recently, I saw a family on TikTok, a mom and her littles, and she said that she had watched a cartoon series on Netflix called City of Ghosts. And it's about actual people who lived in Los Angeles of different backgrounds and some things that we may not normally talk about. And what she's done with the series is that she's sat down with her children and then they've done projects around the series. So that's another resource that I learned on TikTok, which I'm not proud of learning on TikTok, but it turned out to be a good resource.
But I love that. I love that because I think, again, it's something that's fun, right? And don't be afraid. TikTok is fun. I'm on it just to watch, not to do. And so I think that's a great way to introduce concepts, like we've all said, that's not overwhelming. If we're watching TV, we can kind of externalize some of it, right? We can talk about what happened to that character, what happened in that to that family. I always tell my families to watch things like Inside Out or Pixar movies because they have great spaces for emotional development and discovery. And so I agree with that. I think watching TV, watching shows, especially shows that have some of those elements, are really important. And I think it goes to Sarah's point of auditing what's in your family. What type of movies are you always watching? What type of shows are you always watching? What types of entertainment are you always going to? Are you showing them diverse entertainment where they're seeing different languages and different cultures and different identities being expressed? Thankfully, we're getting more representation in that space, but it's been a long time coming where you had such an array of things to show your child that show different identities and different spaces. And so put those in your Netflix queue. I agree with you. Show your family these things, even if it's just to introduce it to them. But I love the idea of having a project along with that. That's beautiful.
And I just want to add one more thing about that. While you're choosing things that represent diversity, please be mindful of the images of the people that you pull into this space. Because if everything that you show your child that has people of color in it is something where they are robbing people or killing people or harming people in some way, that's also sending a message, whether we want to own the message or not. And our media has not done a great job of positively representing people of color. And so being actively choosing things where the message is positive, that shows people in a positive light, is an important thing to do.
Yes, and also that that people of color aren't always victimized either. That can happen a lot in literature and stories that get told is, and even just the tweak of, referring to enslaved people instead of slaves. Like there's a lot of like reframing of history and the way things are talked about that send subtle messages to children. And so there really is a big piece of educating yourself first. And I would say also like not being afraid to tell children, especially white parents who are raising white children, don't be afraid to say, I'm still learning a lot about this too. And we are learning together. And it can take some of the anxiety out of having those conversations if you don't feel like you have to know it all, because you can't possibly anyway. So you might as well admit it, right? And just be a learner with your child.
Yeah. And another thing that I would add to the learning process is learning about your own family. Mm-hmm. There are some truths in our culture that we try to avoid because they are attached to our families. And some of those families owned people. Mm-hmm. Knowing that about your family is important. Knowing perhaps even the people that your family might have enslaved. It's an important piece of history that's attached to your family. And so while it seems like that was so long ago, right? I personally have been doing my own family history, right? Ancestry.com, and have met by way of the internet my grandfather's grandmother, Molly. Molly was enslaved, and Molly's father was a slave owner. So that is part of my family history that I can touch, right? Was this woman, Molly, lived to be 100 years old. My father was 7 when she died. Mm-hmm. So it feels like a long time ago, but it's really not that long ago, mm-hmm. Right? And so, so even though like I grew up with parents who survived the civil rights era and who didn't really talk a lot to me as a child or a young adult about the hardships of being a Black person, because they in their minds had overcome and were working class people and doing great things. And so they didn't think that I would still have to face all the things that they faced. which we all found out later was in error. I also didn't have the benefit of knowing this part of my family, this part of my history. And so finding it out now just makes it all more tangible and real. And I imagine that if those of us who are here in this conversation take the time to do that for your family, one, you'll see that it's really a gift to be able to know this history and to understand it and to just own it and to just say to your children, this is something that's part of our past, it's part of our history. And as a family, we've decided to make better choices.
Yeah.
And also I also sent in my ancestry.com sample, so I'm eagerly awaiting. So it's interesting to hear that from you, Tracy J, because I think I have 2 more weeks before I kind of find out some of my personal history. So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, I haven't sent my sample though. I still have my box. I need to go do the sample.
Yeah,
but I've been doing all the back end, the legwork.
Yeah. And I want to talk a little bit because we discussed kind of bringing diversity into your home, being mindful of the diversity and, you know, the movies and the shows that are being consumed. And another question that came in was about Dr. Seuss, popular childhood author, and the controversy kind of around that. And so for those that aren't familiar, over the past month or two, the Seuss estate decided to stop publication of 6 of Dr. Seuss's books after concluding that they contained racist and ethnic stereotypes. And the world kind of erupted. People were really upset about those books no longer being published and talking about cancel culture and talking about oversensitivity of like, when is it going to stop? And that kind of ties back into why is it always about race? And so I'm wondering if there is a way, because Dr. Seuss is still so popular among children, is there a way that Dr. Seuss and that discussion can be kind of a springboard of talking with kids about racist stereotypes that appear in media?
Well, I was sort of tickled actually by the whole Dr. Seuss cancel culture situation, because the 6 books that were pulled, who even knew about those books? Like, can you even
I never heard of any of them.
No one's reading them because they're not good.
Exactly. And who knows whether or not Dr. Seuss himself ever evolved as a human? We don't know, right? But we do know that his work has produced great things and that it's helpful in teaching children to read. So if the company that is printing his books has decided not to print those books because they know that they're problematic, yay for them. And the rest of us can keep reading Big Fish, Little Fish, whatever, right?
All the green eggs and ham.
Right.
All the places you'll go, you know?
Yes.
Right. Well, cancel culture, this was not an example of cancel culture. And I think I like to consider cancel culture as, you know, the consequences, right? The consequences of your action. This is not like anybody's canceling anything. If somebody decides, we have freedom to spend our money how we want to spend it and to talk about things that we like and don't like. And everybody has a nice public forum on the internet. And if something, you know, if a wave of people decide to stop purchasing something or stop, you know, supporting something, that's a consequence. That's not cancel culture. So I see that completely differently. But this wasn't even a case of that, right? This was
Right.
The publishers of the book decided that it was problematic and decided not to publish it. So
Right.
I also think that it's a good opportunity to talk about the complexity of human beings, right? Like nobody is 100% good or 100% bad. I mean, maybe Mr. Rogers, okay, he has a special place in my heart, but you know, maybe he had his quirks too. Who knows?
I thought you were gonna say he's bad, and I was like, what did he do?
No, like he might be the best. No, he might be someone who's really all good because I have such love for Mr. Rogers, but just that, you know, and not to say that, writing racist and anti-Semitic books is a quirk. Like, obviously the work is very problematic. And if people who are up in arms who haven't looked at what they decided to stop printing probably should take a peek, because it's really quite terrible. And it was, in my opinion, the right decision to stop printing the books.
Yes.
So, but it's a good opportunity, especially for children who have the ability to grasp, the duality, right? The fact that everybody maybe could go, like you said, you don't know if he's grown over the years or he changed his views. Like, sometimes people change, sometimes people don't. Sometimes people are good in many, many ways. And then you find out this thing about them that's really disappointing.
Mm-hmm.
That is happens all the time, right? Like,
Yeah.
that is a part of human beings, to be imperfect, to have problems, to have struggles, to make mistakes. That is part of being a person.
That happened for the Black community in a big way with Bill Cosby. Right?
Yes.
He
Absolutely.
was America's dad, and maybe not just for Black people. I mean, he was America's dad, right? And we watched the Cosby Show. We gathered in mass in front of televisions to watch the Cosby Show, and then to find out this horrible thing that he's done.
Right.
Whether you believe it's true or you don't, whatever, he was accused of doing a really terrible thing, right? And does that take away from the genius of the Cosby Show, or that he made us laugh, or that the family that was represented on the Cosby Show put forth a face of a Black family that was doing well and living a happy life, right? So there's this duality, right, that exists. The other thing about cancel culture, and see, now I'm gonna be on the soapbox, but I'm not gonna stay up here long. Nobody was screaming cancel culture when people were out here burning Nikes.
No.
It didn't get to be cancel culture until we were canceling white people.
Right.
Boom. Mic drop.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, just listening to that space of what you guys just shared, that's how I feel. It's that exact last point that you shared, where when we hold people accountable, that's when things become hard. When we say this person is wrong, and I love that you brought up Bill Cosby, because he needed to be held accountable for whatever he did, right? We always say, people need to be held accountable. So when we do it, we get into, oh, you can't cancel them. We're not canceling everything. We're saying what they've done needs to be addressed. We just talked about, how do we help our kids understand things? We have to address it. But if we're addressing it in our home, but we're allowing our celebrities and our famous people to get away with things, our kids begin to wonder, why should I have to uphold my values if, so-and-so can get on Twitter and say anything, or such and such can write anything, or so-and-so can make songs about anything? Why do I need to hold my values? And I think this is why we really have to really address cancel culture as, I almost sometimes say, awareness culture, right? We're bringing awareness to things that we need to be talking about. Is it hard? Yes. Are these icons and people that we've known for years? Yes. But that doesn't mean they can't be held accountable for the things that they've done. We can be honoring and respectful of the things that they've given us, but we can also critique who they are. I think about this so much, and again, psychology. So much of psychology was done erroneously to people of color, right? So much of it. So we thank God we have these understandings, but now we need to expand our understanding and hold some of those people accountable and really rework and restructure some of the things that are out there, not so that way we can erase things or ban things or cancel things, but so we can build awareness. You can't progress forward if you're like, no, we have to hold on to this old stuff. How can we progress forward? How can we move forward? How can we show our children that progression of, we did wrong, but we're going to learn and do better? If we don't hold people who are famous accountable for doing wrong, giving them a chance to learn if they're alive and able to do so, and then moving forward. We're not erasing people, but we are giving them a space to say, I was wrong, right? My second point to this is, when we say that we have to hold up these outdated and erroneous and really dehumanizing narratives, we're silencing people. We're telling people that your identity doesn't matter. We have to uphold Dr. Seuss because we like him, but we don't care about you. We don't care about your identity. We don't care about what's being shared over generations about you. And this happens to minority races throughout history. Their whole narratives have been silenced and covered up. And so when we uncover it, people people say, oh, you're messing up Thanksgiving. No, we're not. We're telling the real story of how this country came to be. No, we don't want just hand turkeys. We want them to understand what's going on. We're not canceling Thanksgiving, but we're giving people another understanding of it's not just turkey and food. People lost their whole culture and have been silenced ever since we decided Thanksgiving was important, right? And so thinking about that, when we say we're canceling things, we're bringing awareness to something that we, for too long, were okay and complacent with just saying, it's okay, it's old, or we like that. We can't do that anymore. That's the only way we're going to move forward, is we have to go back in our past and say, this was wrong. We have to hold people accountable so we can grow and move forward.
Agree wholeheartedly. The piece I think that is hard, right, is that it needs to be grieved, right? So there's these emotions that come up because we just want it to be simple and fun and easy, and it's not, because we have new information. Yeah. So what grown-ups need to do, right, as the grown-ups, is to grieve that, right? To work through your feelings about it and really grieve it so that you can add those other pieces in that belong. Those pieces belong, like you say, they've been silenced, but they are absolutely part of the story. They're part of the story that have been buried and ignored and silenced. But it's like, you can't unring the bell, right? You can't unknow what you know. But there's a grief process there that I think people spend a lot of time trying to avoid because it's uncomfortable. So I just wanted to say that, because it can sometimes help to just know that that's like a hurdle you have to get through to be able to hold the tension of, like, there's this fun part of it, but there's also this really hard part of it. And that being able to hold both of those things has tension, and it can be difficult.
Can I just want to add one thing about grief? So right now I'm taking a class through Mclaughlin. I don't know if anybody's familiar with his work, but he teaches about embodied racialized trauma. And one of the things he mentions is that like we talk about PTSD, right? And we talk about grief in those terms. But for people of color, it's not post, right? It's persistent and pervasive. So he calls it PPTSD, right? It is ongoing trauma that is compounded every time there's a new trauma. And so while we would love to grieve, we don't always have the space to do so. And so finding healthy ways to deal with the onslaught of stress that never seems to end is also an important thing to remember.
For sure, I 100% agree with that.
I do too. Thanks, Tracy. That was helpful for me as well. So thank you. And I'm looking at the time. So we have about a little less than 15, 20 minutes left. And so I want to pivot into this next question, which is pretty much about white privilege in general. And I'm thinking of like where I live in Maine. And so this is a majority white state. And so how can parents, or how can anyone speak to young people about unpacking race and racism, and also white privilege in a majority white state? And especially when they're saying things like, my child doesn't have any students of color in school, there's no teachers of color, I feel like my life has not been easy, so how can I talk about having white privilege when I feel like that doesn't even exist for us? How is it best to start that conversation, especially if you're in an area where there's just not a large amount of diversity?
So the first thing to understand, I think, is that the idea of white privilege is not that you are not having a hard time, or that you're not living a hard life. It's just that your hard time, your hard life is not because of the color of your skin. So understanding that the privilege in America that is attached to having white skin exists, period. And then navigating from there. But like, to just deny that white privilege is a thing, it's not okay to do, right? And And if you're in a space where you don't have exposure or proximity to people who don't look like you, then, well, one, maybe you should consider taking some trips and seeing some people who don't look like you, maybe, perhaps. I live in Houston, Texas, which is on paper at least the most diverse city in the country. However, our city is still segregated in a lot of ways, and people live in mostly homogenous communities. It's just the way it is. Now, a lot of that is about skin color, but most of it is about economics, right? And so the same is true for many children of color who live in underserved areas. They never see people who don't look like them, right? They never leave their little neighborhoods. And so the idea that there are people in the world who look a different way or think a different way or speak a different way or practice a different religion or whatever doesn't even occur to them, right? And so what do? We put them on a bus and we take them into the city, right? We take a field trip. We go meet some people. We bring people into their school to introduce them to people outside of their world, right? Because if you never get exposure to people outside of your world, then you start to think that that's the only way the world is. And well, we know that that's not right.
Yeah, I have to piggyback off that idea that I think privilege, because the nature of the word, makes people think that they have more than they have. And so I oftentimes will, when I teach multicultural counseling to new MFTs, and we talk a lot about privilege is what do people see when they look at you and what can they gather just by looking at you, right? And so we all kind of just look around the room, right? And it's mostly female in this program for unfortunate reasons, but it tends to be mostly female. And we all begin to look at, if you just look at people, you see so much difference, but you only see skin color usually and gender are the only two things when you see people initially. You don't have an opportunity to know their education level, where they live, the language they speak. You're just looking. And so when I'm talking to both white Americans and people of color, we look at that idea of privilege as, what do people gather just by looking at you, and what access does that afford you? That's where your privilege is, right? I often talk about having a heterosexual relationship. When me and my husband go out and show affection, no one gags or makes an inference. It's fine. Interestingly enough, about 40 years ago, that wouldn't be fine. I'm in an interracial relationship. My husband is white, but now it is, right? Now we can do that. Whereas my colleagues and friends and family members who are in the LGBTQIA space, they can't do that safely everywhere, right? If they show affection to their partner, they may be ostracized or ridiculed or discriminated against, or better yet, hurt, or worse yet, rather hurt. And so it's about that is what I always ask people to think of. When you hear the word white privilege or any other type of privilege, don't think that means that people are assuming you have more. Realize that what that means is when you walk into a room, whatever people see is what gives you access. And whatever access you have means you have privilege just from that. And I think we need to really start to understand that that's really the base of white privilege. There's so much more. We could probably do a whole nother 90-minute session on just that. But I think it's really good to help us understand that when people see you and the access or the doors that are open based on that is the privilege that you have in that moment. Being able-bodied, right? Being cisgender, right? These are all things that I have privilege in. I can just walk in, but being African-American is not a privilege for me. When I walk in, people usually stop and ask for some identification. Who am I? They want to know, while I will watch other white Americans just kind of walk to and fro and no one's stopping them, right? And so that's privilege. That's that space. And I think we need to really hone in on that, understand it. And then, as I've said this whole thing, I'm a broken record on this, then check in with, how do you feel about that? Right? How do you feel about that? Because that's what you're going to give to your kids. That's what you're going to give to your family. And you have to be mindful about that as you're dealing with these concepts. You can't give what you don't have, and you will give what you have, even if it's not right. And so always taking time to sit back and say, when someone says white privilege to me, what do I think about that? Because that's what I'm going to end up telling my child.
Mm-hmm. I think that it's really important to introduce a concept even to children who are white and live in Maine and don't see any other Black people, or people of color, people of other who have differences, which in many parts of the state is true. Probably not Portland. Portland is the most diverse place probably in Maine. But I think of this in terms of making assumptions, which is a lot of what you were kind of getting at, Mercedes. But another really great way to introduce this is around fairness, because you're talking about the assumptions that people make and then the advantages that people get based on those assumptions. And so I don't, once kids are, in preschool and can talk, or in kindergarten, I think it's okay to start, again, laying that foundation about, what would you do if your friend, and if they don't know anybody who has dark skin, you can use eye color. Like there's a whole bunch of experiments that were done around that are very, very eye-opening. If you haven't seen, the videos are on YouTube, and they are really quite jarring. But what if somebody made an assumption about you, and then you got treated unfairly, or you made an assumption about your friend and your friend got treated unfairly? Like, you can come up with a scenario that a child can relate to. It doesn't even have to be about race, but it's about these assumptions that are made, privileges that are given, and how unfair it is, right? And kids get that, right? They can understand that when you frame it in a scenario that they can relate to about a friend, especially when they're old enough and they have friends and they care about their friends and they care about fairness, right? And teaching them the difference between equity and equality, and how those are really different things. I think that there's many, many foundational conversations that you can start to have, that then when they start to learn about race and racism more, it becomes a layer, and it hopefully starts to click more and more as you keep having conversations.
Yeah, and any child who has siblings understands fairness very quickly, right? Yep. You're always letting her do such and such because she's the baby, or she gets to do everything she wants because she's the oldest, right? And so we have concepts that we can go to that children understand immediately, without having to put on the idea of race or gender identity or any of those other things, just things that they see every day.
Yeah. One other thing I was thinking about too, and piggybacking kind of off of what both Sarah and Tracy J just said right now, is we can also take our kids places. I think in Maine, it's probably, I don't want to assume that everyone can go somewhere or everyone can do something, but I often remember going so many places in books, going so many places in movies. I would just go to the library, and I was one of those kids, like Tracy J mentioned, who I grew up in the inner city. I grew up in South Central LA, where that's all I knew for a very long time. But I was able to learn about other cultures because I had a library card, and I could go and read books, and I can go learn and grow. And so when I came into contact with these different individuals, I had read so many books and had seen so many movies. And again, back then it wasn't always great, but thankfully I was able to find the educational spaces as well as the unfortunate spaces. But I was able to understand that these are people who exist in the world before I ever saw anyone who looked like that or heard anyone that looked like that. I want to take a moment to kind of really hone in on the fact that when I grew up, South Central LA, African-American family, I grew up in South Central LA in the 90s. I don't know if you know anything about that, but research it. You'll become really aware of what the racial tensions look like then. And I grew up in a Christian family. So as far as being sheltered, I was under a roof with a chapel above us, but I still was able to learn more because, again, I had access to information. Thankfully, I lived in LA, which is a more metropolitan city. But I think even if you live in rural areas or you live in areas where there's not that much access to activity, we do have a bigger space now with the internet. We do have a bigger space now with books. There are so many more books being written than there were when I was growing up, at every age, from babies all the way up to old people with big print and all the different languages. And I say that because no longer is it acceptable for us to say, I don't live near X, Y, or Z. Unfortunately, now that's not acceptable. Before, when we didn't have the internet and access to so much, yes, you could say, I don't live near, but you can get away from your area through books, through travel, as Tracy J mentioned earlier, if that's something you can do. But really, it's not allowing yourself to say, because I live in an area that lacks diversity, I don't know how to talk about it. Really be proactive and intentional about how to bring these spaces into your family, even if it's just through books right now, even if you only get to plan one trip a year where you do something, even if you only get to go into the city once a month because that's all your money has, you have money for. Those are still important spaces because, again, this conversation is not a sprint. You're going to be having this conversation throughout your child's life because even though you live in this little area, that's not the only area in the world. We talked about it earlier, how every week the news is talking about diversity, whether positively or negatively. And so I think we really have to also expand our mind and say, I know I don't live in a very diverse area, or I know I don't have access to tangible diversity right in my area, but I can be proactive. I can plan things. I think about what Tracy J shared earlier about watching movies and planning projects around them. These are ways to be really intentional about bringing that in, even if you don't have it right here in your local area all the time. And I think we have to start giving ourselves permission to say we can be more expansive, we can be more intentional about the things that we're doing, even if it's not right at our fingertips.
That's so true. It's such an empathy builder too, right? When you enter someone else's experience. I'm just thinking of some of the books. My son's going on 13, and we've read, picture books for 5-year-olds about the immigrant experience. We recently read a graphic novel about an African-American man growing up in New York City. We read another graphic novel about, two brothers who lived in a refugee camp, and we read them together. He reads them and I read them, and then we talk about them. I don't personally know any of those people, but that doesn't really matter because we were able to access it, talk about it, talk about some of the issues, and it is such an empathy builder to bring other people's experiences into your home and into your heart, really.
Can I just for a second also celebrate the families who are here listening, who are doing the work? Because I know a lot of this is like coming down on people who aren't doing, right? But just bravo to the people who are doing the work, who know that there's a need that they maybe can't feel on their own, and that they're going out in search of answers. Bravo to you. Like I get a lot of flack from other Black people for celebrating white people who are trying, but I think it's important that white people are trying. So keep trying.
And again, I echo that. And I think, look at here, right? If you say, well, I live in an area where there is no diversity, look at what technology has given us, right? I think Tori started off by saying everyone's in a different time zone, but we're all able to do this because of technology. And so we have so much that we can do. Like Tracy J just said, again, I commend you as well, coming here, deciding to do this. It's late on the West Coast. It's 4 here, but I know it's later for a lot of other people who are looking at it on the East Coast. And so you're deciding to do this. So I agree. This is what we just talked about. This is that intentionality. This is saying, I don't have it here, but I have resources and I can go to webinars or I can go to things like this and still learn. And I think that's something, again, yes, Tracy J, to be celebrated and to commend yourself for doing. I agree.
Now don't take that celebration and stop. Keep going.
Right, exactly.
So I think, and I very much agree. And again, I'm just a huge thank you to everybody that has joined us and come to this conversation, because I think it's extremely important. And before we kind of close, I know we're getting close to 7:30, I would love for each of you to give a piece or two of advice, especially for the parents on this call and for people that are just new to this conversation in terms of talking about race, talking about racism. I think a lot of people, to them, it can be a very intimidating conversation. And I think for everything, we always want there to be a finish line. And there's really no finish line when we're diving into race and racial equity. This is a lifetime journey. This is a marathon. There's really no end to this. And so for people that are just getting into the fight, what advice do you have for them to kind of continue the fight? And then for people that have been in it for a little while and are getting fatigued, what can you provide them in terms of just powerful words to help them stay in this fight? Because I call it a fight because I think that's exactly what it is. And it's really, ongoing, and there are gonna be days it beats you up. And so I would love to hear a piece of advice from each of you as we kind of close this out. And any of you
I'll start. I don't mind starting. So in my work, you might see this acronym on the wall behind me. I use this sort of an agreement for graceful conversations, and it's an acronym that says love, and the L is listen with your heart, O is observe your own biases, V is venture into unfamiliar territory, and E is expect the best. And so we start our conversations from that space. If we start from a place of love and listening and knowing where we have blind spots and recognizing that it might not be familiar territory, and also like going in it with an open mind and being excited about the journey, I think that that's helpful. We started this conversation with an elephant metaphor, and like knowing that the elephant is there, and like it stinks, it's big, it takes up a lot of space, it eats a lot, like it's a big thing, right? And so like not pretending that this big thing is not there, or that if we just ignore it, it'll go away. Like, no, you're gonna have to move it. If you ever want to use your space properly, you're gonna need to move the elephant. So just take your time, be gentle, try not to get trampled or sat on, and, keep going.
Yeah. Can I interject too and say, will you also let everyone know where they can find you, what your website is, if you feel comfortable sharing your email? So Tracy J, can you let everyone know that as well?
Yes. My website is quietrebellife.com, all together, no spaces or hyphens. And if you search for me on the internet, I am Googleable, Tracy with an IEJAE. It's pretty easy to find me.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off of what Tracy said. I love the other elephant analogy. How do you eat an elephant? Right? One piece at a time, right? And I love that because I think oftentimes, and I've said it before, we often think with big, intense conversations, we have to have them, and then that's it. And I oftentimes will tell parents, you have to continue to have these conversations. You have to continue to search and learn and grow for yourself as well as for your child. For those who are just getting started, this is a journey. You will not learn everything in one webinar or one book. Keep going. I'm a huge proponent of using social media for good. And so I constantly tell people, build your social media around what you're interested in learning about and following people and influencers and people doing the work so you can continue to get resources. You can continue to learn. Don't just have your social media full of frivolousness or outdated ideas. I also am a huge proponent of giving yourself breaks, whether you're a person of color or not, giving yourself a break to say, I'm actually going to turn the news off today, and I'm going to turn my phone off today, and I'm going to enjoy my family. I think at one point, Tracy J talked about joy. Finding the joy too. You don't always have to talk about race in terms of negativity. You can find the joy, right? Looking at all the historical things that so many people of color have contributed to the world. Doing another project of going around the world and seeing what in our home was created by someone of color, what in our community. Those are beautiful things to do where if I'm tired of talking about the intensity and the racism and the negativity, I can still have race conversations by talking about the joys and the celebrations of different people and different identities. And so also realizing that you get to make this decision for your family. And so continuously talk about it. Make sure you and your family are on the same page, listening when people are saying they're tired, listening when people are saying they like to do something, and really creating this, I would say in your family, really creating this safe space to discuss tough issues. So whether someone's curious, whether someone knows, whether someone doesn't know, we're all here together to support each other. I think that'll help everyone just in this longer journey than making it be this one big, huge family conversation that we have to have and then never talking about it again. Just kind of infusing it into your life.
I love that. I love what both of you said. what came into my mind was the quote. I had to look it up. It's Emma Lazarus, whom I actually don't know who she is. I'm gonna have to do a little research, but the gist of the quote is that none of us are free until all of us are free. And so really just acknowledging that all of our humanity is kind of bound up with each other, and that I find that very motivating for keeping my own self in the game. And I love that this whole conversation was called, an uncomfortable conversation, right? Having uncomfortable conversations. And I think that that's my piece of advice, both for people who are just joining the conversation and for people who have, read lots of books and are still, in the fight, as you say, Tori, is that being uncomfortable is part of it. Being uncomfortable is not an emergency. I would say get comfortable with being uncomfortable, but the whole point is that you actually don't get comfortable, and that is okay. And just tagging that as the reality of the situation is that that it's not an emergency is what I tell myself. If it's upsetting, if it's uncomfortable, that is okay, that's not an emergency. I don't need to do anything about that piece, except maybe get myself regulated before I talk to my kid, right? So that's my parting thought. Mercedes, did you want to tell people where they can find you online?
Sure, I totally forgot about that until you started talking. So I'm pretty much like Tracy J. If you look up Mercedes Cemudio, you'll find me all over the internet. But you can find me on shameproofparenting.com. And that's a great starting point to learn more about the work I'm doing and how to connect with me.
Yep. And Mercedes wrote a great book called Shame Proof Parenting that you can also get online, I am assuming. And you can find me, I'm at sarahmclaughlin.com, but I'm Googleable, but you usually have to add in like my LSW or parenting. Otherwise you get a whole bunch of stuff about the singer, which is really annoying. But if you add parenting after my name, all my stuff comes up too. And I have a new book coming out this year called Raising Humans with Heart. It's literally at the publisher, like getting final dots and I's and T's, but I'll let you know when it's available. So yeah, thank you. Mercedes got an advanced copy and wrote a nice blurb for me. So, and I just thank you all for being here. And it's been a real pleasure and a privilege.
Yeah, I want to add to that. And it's 7:31. I don't know that I have ever perfectly timed out a webinar. So that was beautiful. So thank you all so much for being here and for spending your afternoon/evening with me and with all of us. I really appreciate it. I know it was a really rich conversation. I'm seeing a lot of positive comments come in as well, which is really nice. So just a huge thanks to all of you, and a huge thank you as well to everyone that joined us and everyone that is doing the work and engaging and trying and talking to young people about race and about racism and having all of these hard but uncomfortable conversations. And I also just want to let everyone know again that this is part of our Momentum series. So a huge thank you to the folks at GPCOG, to the Portland Regional Chamber, to Portland Public Library, to Maine Historical Society, and to United Way for partnering on this series. We're hoping to bring to you more months of information about intentional allyship and being intentionally anti-racist, and providing all of these resources to all of you for as often as we can. So please make sure that you are finding the link which was shared in the chat so that you can get registered for the series. And our next resource drop will be at the beginning of April. And like I mentioned earlier, is going to be about anti-Asian discrimination. And so we're going to be sharing resources surrounding that. And I'm really looking forward to the panel presentation that we're going to have regarding that topic as well. So again, my email I think has been put in the chat as well. So if any questions you have didn't get answered or you have any comments, just feel free to send me an email. And again, just a huge thanks to all of you and to the panelists for spending your evening with us. And we'll talk soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.